better daily, where we work hard in our minds, bodies, and our spirits to become 1% better every single day. Download the app and join our Betterment family at betterdaily.live to catch the video version of these podcasts. Here's your host and my dad, Alex Van Houten.
What is up, Betterment family? This is Alex Van Houten in Better Daily Live. Happy Wednesday. It is Wildcard Wednesday, and on Wildcard Wednesday, you never know what you're going to get. And today, you're going to get a treatise or a 101 on fasting, and I'm very excited to bring that to you. Yesterday, I talked a bit about why I don't recommend intermittent fasting on Nutrition Tip Tuesday, and in today's episode you'll get an opportunity to hear more about what fasting is. And I do recommend fasting, not intermittent fasting as we know it, but I do recommend fasting. I do think it's a powerful practice. It's an important tool in the tool belt of anybody working toward achieving betterment in their life, especially if you're going to use nutrition to get there. And so I talked through that in depth. I recorded this episode just over a year ago, and I had lots of questions about fasting, how to incorporate a fasting practice, what fasting actually means. And so it's an excellent episode. And if you have questions about fasting that I can fill for you while you're live here, please drop them in the comments. I will make sure and cover them for you. Good morning, Pat. Good to see you this morning. And so there's a lot going on in this episode. I talk about my history with fasting. I talk about what I see as the origins of fasting and what I understand them to be historically. And I also talk about some of the research. And my goal on this episode was to give people an opportunity to springboard, to have a starting point, to know enough to be dangerous, so to speak. Good morning, KT. Good to see you this morning. But one of the things that I wanted to highlight in that episode, and what you're about to hear and what I'll link here, is the idea of feasting on something else while you're fasting. So there's this theme throughout the Old and New Testament. In Psalms it says, "As the deer pants for the water, so my soul longs after you." That's, I'm thirsty for God, is what the psalmist is saying. And actually, there's another place in the New Testament where Jesus is being tempted by Satan, and Satan's telling him, "Hey, you're the Son of God. You can turn these stones into bread." And so Jesus rebukes Satan and uses Deuteronomy to do it. And he says, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God." The idea that sustenance comes not just from what we eat, but from God himself. And then in the Gospel of John, the disciples are going to get some food, and they ask Jesus, do you have any food? And he says, "I have food that you don't know anything about." And he's talking about doing the good work of the Father who sent him. And so that's sustaining to him. That's good to him. And so one of the things that I talk about in this episode is that when you're fasting, it's extremely important that you give yourself something else in your meal times. Because one of the things about fasting is that you create a hunger in yourself. And it's a physical hunger. You want something to eat, right? You create a hunger in yourself. But when you hunger, that hunger can be filled with something else. It's not calories necessarily. And it's really hard to describe this in language that doesn't quickly enter the spiritual world. But imagine, for instance, that you skipped lunch today on purpose. I'm fasting through lunch. And maybe you have a little bit of hunger pains. Maybe you don't. Maybe you work, and that's great, whatever. But about 2 or 3 p.m., you're starting to get hungry. You're starting to think about food, and you kind of want to go to the pantry. Maybe you even get up and go to the break room looking for a snack, and you're like, "Oh dang, I'm fasting. I'm not going to eat this." If you abort that mission and then go sit down at your desk and you're like, "Well, I'm just going to be hungry," and then you go about your work, it's not very satisfying. But if you can give yourself something else to feast on, intentionally, something that you say, "Hey, during my fasting practice, I'm going to feast on this instead." So folks I've worked with in the past have feasted on a book, maybe even the Bible. And they said, "Hey, every time I'm hungry, I'm going to, read a chapter. Or every time I'm hungry, I'm going to read 10 pages. And so I'm going to feast on that instead. Or maybe you feast on music. Maybe when you're hungry, you have some songs that you really appreciate. Maybe they put you in a good mindset or a good strong place inside of yourself. And so you feast on this music instead. You play this music. I personally like to feast on prayer, and I do that in the form of walking with music. And so if there's a point in my fasting practice where I'm hungry and I'm kind of looking around for food and stuff, then going for a walk and listening to music and praying about something that's important to me is powerful as well. KT says, I start a conversation with someone and have some kind of personal engagement. I love that. That's a really good example of what I'm talking about here. Is that say I'm hungry, I'm looking for something, and that's a great cue to pick up the phone and call somebody I've been meaning to call, or to get up from my desk and go have a friendly conversation with somebody else. Because when you're fasting, you learn a relationship with hunger. And hunger is a weird thing, and maybe I'll do a word Thursday on this. I don't need to dive into the etymology and stuff here, but hunger is a weird thing. It's like a longing for something. It's a desire to be filled, a longing for something. And food is not the only thing that we long for. And when you fast, you're making a conscious effort to close the door on food as the thing that you fill yourself up with. And it's such a cool thing because, in our day and age, food is so widely available that it's almost like we're not aware how often we use food to fill up a longing that has nothing to do with food, right? So maybe you had a really bad day. Maybe you just had a terrible day. And what you really need right now is to talk it out with somebody. You need to not be alone in that. You need to be able to articulate your deepest, darkest, most frustrated and depressed thoughts. You need to be able to take your anger out on something. Maybe you could use a good weightlifting session, but instead you turn on Netflix and grab a bag of chips and, drown your sorrows, right? And unless you're Pat, the sorrows are drowned in Ben and Jerry's. If I remember right, Pat, you're not much of a bag of chips kind of guy. Sorry to call you out there. And yeah, KT says it can really fill you up. It can really fill you up to have a great conversation with somebody. And that's what I'm talking about here is there's many things that we long for in a day that aren't food. And one of the cool things about fasting and making it a point to choose something else to feast on, one of the cool things about fasting is developing a powerful relationship with hunger. To recognize longing, to recognize hunger. And as weird as it sounds, if you had a bad day and you really should have a conversation, but you're going to fill it up with potato chips instead, how about we flip the script? Maybe you're really hungry, you haven't eaten for 24 hours, and a bag of potato chips would be really good right now, but instead we're going to fill up with something else. I know it. For the average person, it sounds very outlandish, but the psychology is very robust. It's a very similar circuit. When you fill yourself with something satisfying, when you fill yourself with something that is good and emotionally regulating and positive, even if it's not food, you can have a lot of the same neurotransmitters released by doing that. Janet says a fasting buddy can be really encouraging to stay with. And yeah, when you're it's hard to feel really connected and together with people in our world anyway, but when you're fasting, you're even a little more isolated, and for me that solitude is actually something that I crave. So that's kind of the point of the practice for me sometimes. But that said, it's simple to it's almost like I'm isolated but I'm connected. I'm me and this person who I'm fasting with, we're united. Well, the rest of the world doesn't need to know about it, because something else that Jesus says in the New Testament about fasting specifically is that when you do so, your reward actually seems diminished if everybody knows about it. If the whole world knows, that guy is fasting, look at him, he's unenergetic. He actually says, don't do as the religious leaders do when they tear their clothes and put ash on their hair. Surely they have their reward. That's their virtue. Like, look at me, I'm so holy, I'm fasting, right? It's like, they've got their reward. But he says, when you fast, do so in secret, so that your heavenly Father will reward you. Put oil in your hair, bring a good countenance to the world around you. walk slowly through the crowd with a smile, right? Because the point of fasting is not, oh, woe is me, I'm so hungry, everybody should notice how virtuous and awesome I am. And he was talking in religious terms, but the same can be said here, and I talk about that in this episode, is that when you fast, if you can have a fasting buddy, that's awesome, because you guys can kind of be alone together and praying for each other and encouraging each other. And Pat said, put sardine oil in your hair. My wife would not let me in the house, dude. She just wouldn't. She's already not a huge fan of my love for sardines, but the sardine oil would kill it. I would love to stay married for a long time and stay attractive to my wife, so I'm gonna skip on that one. But I hope you guys really appreciate this episode. Fasting 101, it's a really good, I believe, starting point and springboard for those who are new to fasting. I recorded the episode with the purpose of those who are, hey, I've never tried fasting before, I don't know what this is all about. 30 minutes to help people understand where to get started, what it's about, how to do it right, why intermittent fasting might not be the best thing for them, and what's also happening in the body that's beneficial. But also, if you have fasted in the past, and you might even say you're maybe not advanced, I don't know, how do you get advanced at fasting? I don't know how to measure that, how many days you fasted before maybe. But even if you've fasted before and feel pretty comfortable and confident, I believe there's something in this for you as well. So guys, thank you so much for joining me for Wildcard Wednesday and today's episode, Fasting 101. I think it'll be beneficial and powerful for you, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about how you fasted, why you fast, and what you have found has been helpful to you in that practice. So this has been Alex Van Houten in Better Daily Live. Thank you guys for joining me. Tomorrow is Word Thursday. But until then, it's just 1%. You got this.
Fasting is such an interesting phenomenon in the health and fitness world that it's almost impossible at this point to do a comprehensive expose of the topic. But since it's one of the top 5 most commonly asked questions that my clients have on a regular basis, I'd be doing my listeners a disservice if I didn't spend some time on it. The other 4, if you're curious, are sleep, supplements, hormones, and macros, which gives you a little bit of insight into why we've spent so much time on each of those topics on this show. But fasting is its own different beast, and I hope today that by talking about some of my experience, as well as my practical application for clients, that will lay the groundwork for an intelligent introduction to fasting, let you walk away with some things that you can use today, and lead us to a broader conversation regarding the scientific literature around fasting. Wish me luck. For this episode, we're going to start with the question, what is fasting? And then I'm going to tell you about my personal background and how it intersected with the world of health and fitness. Then I'm going to cover some of the fads in the world and how they're affecting people both positively and negatively. And then by the end of this, I hope to give you a few tools or ideas around how you might incorporate fasting into your health and fitness discipline. So first, what is fasting? Our current definition of fasting is to abstain from food and in some cases, fluid intake. This is most commonly used in daily language where we refer to the meal breakfast. Breakfast, break fast, is the meal we eat after we've fasted all night sleeping. And so it's safe to say that on average, most people observe a fast every single day. And unless you're waking up in the middle of the night, eating snacks before you go back to bed, that fast can last anywhere from 8 to 16 hours. The verb fast, F-A-S-T, in English has a German etymology, meaning to stand firm or to hold fast. In reference to food specifically, it means to exercise one's full willpower over one's self. And the word goes further back in the Greek, nesteia, which means abstinence, and even further than that into the Hebrew, the word sound, which literally means to cease in the partaking of the enjoyment of food. Why the history lesson, Alex? I'm glad you asked, because since fasting as a practice has come to the attention of the health and fitness industry, it has blown up into a wide variety of very interesting definitions of something very simple. For our purposes today, as we talk about intermittent fasting, time-restricted eating, protein-supported fasting, It's important for us to be speaking the same language around fasting. Quite simply, fasting is to deprive the body of nutrients and the satisfaction of eating on purpose. And in a world where the vast majority of people have not gone without food on purpose in a very long time, it's often a strange and foreign concept that requires some explaining. Now, before I get to differences in definition among the health and fitness space, and how I use fasting practices with my clientele, I think it's important to tell you about how I came to fasting, because while I use it as a tool in the tool belt of my clients' health and fitness practice, for me, fasting was born out of a spiritual context. I first encountered fasting while studying the Bible in adolescence. In fact, growing up in Christian communities, particularly a Baptist community wherein potlucks abound, fasting was something that was often read about in a biblical context, but very rarely ever practiced, or at least in a way that I understood it. As a child, I grew up under the poverty line, and going without food would have been a very bad thing. So the idea of giving up food on purpose was very strange to me. And as we'll talk about later, fasting as a practice is not really appropriate to children and adolescents who are undergoing their important stages of development and require a lot of nourishment and nutrients in order to ensure there are no delays in the development of their muscle tissue, their bone, their tendons and ligaments, and even their brain. That said, I remember reading about people like King David, who after doing something deplorable, gave up food for a time, to show God how serious and repentant he was, and to make a statement to his royal courts around him. I also remember reading about people like Moses, Elijah, and even Jesus, who fasted regularly, and for long periods of time. And as a kid, I interpreted these things to mean that fasting was a spiritual practice that had an important role to play in creating a direct line between the physical world and the spiritual world. Honestly, I didn't think about fasting much further than that, until at age 18, I read a book by a man named Richard Foster called The Celebration of Discipline. And in the book, Richard Foster explored several different spiritual disciplines that in his mind were of paramount importance to the development of a righteous man. The book was well written and had a profound impact on me, and so I personally began to experiment with fasting. I was young and dumb, so I did a lot of really silly things that I would recommend you not do, like consuming only orange juice for 2 days while working a construction job and training for a marathon. #never again. I did several other experiments when I was 18, by the way, that though I learned a lot from, I wouldn't recommend to most people. In fact, speaking of the Bible, Proverbs says that a wise man learns from the mistakes of those who have come before him, and a fool has to learn for himself. 18-year-old Alex was much more fool than wise, but hopefully because of his experiences, we can all be a little wiser with regard to our fasting practice. So I came to fasting as a discipline through a spiritual practice. Once I got smarter and better at it, it was an important part of my self-discovery process, and even to this day, remains a mostly spiritual act for me. However, something interesting happened after a few years of practicing fasting, and that is, the health and fitness industry that I worked in started to become very interested in fasting as a health and fitness practice. I'll never forget the first time a client came to our session and said, "Hey, should I be doing this intermittent fasting thing I've been hearing about?" And being unfamiliar with the new scientific literature that was coming out, I said to my client, "Like a Christian fast, or are we talking Ramadan here?" And they just looked at me weird, because they didn't realize they were talking about a spiritual discipline, or at least what I understood to be a spiritual discipline. Instead, they were referencing research about how fasting for particular periods of time seemed to improve metabolic rates, or even hormonal panels for some people. And so they were asking if they should be going without food for a period of time in order to improve their health and fitness results. I went home after training that client for a session and started looking for everything I could find on research related to fasting and its effects on the body. At first, I was pissed off and frustrated because what I thought the benefits of fasting were for me were much bigger than stabilizing blood sugar, boosting the immune system, improving fat burn in your workouts, or even weight loss. But as I kept reading, and over the years the research continued to pour out, I became increasingly fascinated of the positive and powerful repercussions that helping my clients develop a fasting practice could have for their bodies and minds. For me personally, fasting continues to be a spiritual practice. However, I'd be lying if I told you that it wasn't a lot of fun to also know the positive and healthy benefits that are occurring in my body when I exercise that spiritual discipline. So now that you know where I'm coming from, let's talk about how I use fasting with my clients, some of the potential positive benefits, and some of the pitfalls that people are falling into when they do this whole fasting thing. So here are the 5 things you need to know about fasting in order to get started. First, your mindset around fasting really matters. There's a big difference between going without food on purpose, with purpose, than going without food because you don't have any. This is a paramountly important aspect of fasting that's not really explored in the scientific literature. Jesus actually says it this way: when you fast, make sure you oil your hair, wash your face, and put on great clothes. Walk slowly through the crowd with a smile on your face, and go about your business the same way you would if you were eating. Then you'll have the reward of your fasting. Don't do as some do, and engage in your fast in a way that lets everybody know that you're fasting. Tearing your clothes, putting ash on your hair, and laying in the floor in order to draw attention to the fact that you're hungry. Surely, you already have your reward. What Jesus was saying is it's not just important that you fast, it's important how you fast. And while there are spiritual implications to what Jesus had to say about fasting there, the same could be said about the physical response in your body to your fasting practice. From a physical perspective, at its core, fasting is a lot like exercise. It's an intentional stressor that's placed on the body in order to achieve a particular change. If I go for a run on purpose and I enjoy my run, it has a very different effect on my body than if I run away from a mountain lion. In both scenarios, I'm running. The action is the same. However, my belief about the action is different, and therefore it impacts my body differently. In the one case, exercise running creates adaptations that make me stronger, more endurable, better at burning fat as a fuel source, and more resilient, while the adaptations from running from a mountain lion breaks me down on the inside, makes my hair stop growing, my sex hormones stop being produced, and my adrenal glands tap out all of my energy stores. Because when you're running from a mountain lion, the body's not worried about getting stronger for next time, it's just worried about not dying right now. The same could be said of fasting. If you decide to abstain from food, it's important to have the appropriate mindset. Know why you're doing it, and set that expectation well. Be intentional about the things you want to feast on while you're fasting. For me in particular, when I'm very hungry during a fast or during normal meal times, I'll take a walk, read a book, do some writing, or listen to music instead, which have very different effects on me than sitting at the table, watching everybody else eat, and constantly reminding myself via willpower that I'm not eating today. When you're fasting, your mindset matters. Set yourself up for success, set your expectations well, and give yourself some meaningful alternatives for feasting while fasting. The second thing you need to know to get started fasting is that there's no shame in starting small. Remember I told you that the average person hasn't gone without food for a 24-hour period for a very long time? Just because they haven't gone a day without food doesn't mean they don't fast regularly. Remember, the word breakfast, break fast, comes from the idea that we generally don't eat while we're sleeping, unless we have a very strange sleeping cycle, and so most everybody fasts at least 12 to 16 hours every day. When you first get started with a fasting practice, one of the simplest ways to do that is to just grow from your current fast. If you ate dinner at 5 p.m. yesterday, and you put off breakfast until lunchtime today, then congratulations. You've achieved a 20-hour fast. And as fasting becomes an object of study, we're finding that there are different things that happen at different times when fasting. For instance, for most people, 20 hours is about the time that they completely burn through their glycogen stores. That is to say, you don't have any stored sugar left in your body, and so it signals to the body that you're in a fasted state. Many changes occur, including the release of growth hormone, the production of ketones, and the triggering of the immune system in a process called autophagy. In some studies, a 20-hour fast, a couple times a month, has been shown to improve health markers like insulin sensitivity and even decreases in rates of depression and anxiety. But the fun doesn't stop there. For folks who are new to a fasting practice, experimenting with pushing their fast longer, going to the 24, 36, or even 48-hour mark, can open the door to many positive and powerful benefits from a mental and physical perspective. When it comes to developing a fasting practice, there's no shame in starting small. At this point, I think it's important to note that the average human being can go somewhere between 3 and 5 weeks without a bite of food and without causing catastrophic damage to their internal organ system. So as you're starting small and learning what hunger cues feel like and how to manage them, remember, your body was built for this. It can handle it just fine, and just like exercise, if you stick with it, you'll get better every time. The third thing you should know is that fasting affects men and women differently. I've mentioned research on this show that highlights the physical differences between how men respond to fasting and how women respond to fasting. The short of it is, a fasting practice seems to do really well with men and with menopausal or postmenopausal women. Other medical issues notwithstanding, those demographics generally do well to develop a fasting practice. However, the bodies of women of childbearing age, especially if pregnant or lactating, should be very cautious about fasting at all. Personally, with my clients, again, other medical issues notwithstanding, men have carte blanche to develop a fasting practice as they see fit and are able to do so. And women of menopausal or postmenopausal age get to do the same. But when it comes to the amazing, life-giving hormonal system of a female of childbearing age, I find a regular fasting practice to be unsustainable, unhelpful, and probably unhealthy. And what little research there is on the subject actually seems to bear that out and warrants its own show altogether. Just note that fasting affects men and women differently. And while you might hear hype about how particular body compositions can be achieved given certain fasting and feeding windows, I caution you to see who those studies are done on and whether or not they might be applicable to you in your situation. I just had a conversation yesterday with the daughter of one of my clients who at age 17 is extremely athletic, very active, and interested in the intermittent fasting hype. She had already experimented on herself a little bit and was relieved when I explained to her the hormonal impact of fasting and why it probably made her feel the way she felt. Her exact words were, "Thank you very much, Alex. I was reading all about this stuff, and I thought there was something wrong with me because after a week of this fasting thing, I didn't feel great, my performance was lower, and I'd actually gained a few pounds." Fasting affects men and women differently. Make sure you pay attention to who the studies are being done on. The number 4 thing you need to know about fasting is that it's best done intermittently. This is actually an ironic thing to say because I think the intermittent fasting diet fad is so ridiculous. Let me explain why. Intermittent fasting, or time-restricted eating, is often practiced in the health and fitness world as a thing that people do every single day. I had a client who came to me who was on the OMAD diet. That is kind of like an intermittent fasting diet that has a 20-hour fasting window and a 4-hour feeding window. And so this gentleman was kind of frustrated because after 3 months of fasting 20 hours a day and eating giant meals for 4 hours a day, his weight loss had plateaued. And I find this to be a very common theme in those who are practicing fasting in the health and fitness community. They try to make a regular schedule out of a fasting practice, expecting positive body composition results. Here's the thing about fasting. Remember, at its core, it's a positive stressor to create an adaptation in the body. But just like exercise, you can't just go to the gym and do the same workout every single day and expect to continue seeing progress in yourself. When you do something every single day, your body adapts to it, and it ceases to be a stressor. I think it's worth saying again. If you do something every single day, your body adapts to it, and it ceases to be a stressor. So I say that fasting should be done intermittently, not the intermittent fasting that's coined if you Google it, but intermittently meaning that your body can't anticipate when it's going to happen. My first exposure to the word intermittent was with my 1988 Honda Accord. There was a period of time where I'd sit down in the car, stick my key in the ignition, and go to start it. Sometimes it would start on the first try, and sometimes it took 10 tries for it to start. #embarrassing. When I took it to the mechanic, he said that I had an intermittent starting issue. That meant sometimes it started and sometimes it didn't. And there was no rhyme or reason as to when it did and when it didn't. That's what intermittent should mean with regard to your fasting practice. Fasting's not something to be done the same exact way every single day. Instead, it should be applied as a stressor to the body in a way that makes the body adapt to it. So one of the things that I did with the client that I told you about, who had been doing his 20 hours a day fast with a 4-hour feeding window, is we stopped doing that. We ate like normal people every single day, getting enough protein, enough carbs, enough fats, and exercising regularly. And then, once every 2 weeks, we implemented a 24 to 36-hour fast in his life. That meant for him, every other Thursday, he either ate dinner that night or skipped dinner altogether if he was feeling great and had breakfast on Friday morning. The results, from a body fat perspective, were amazing for him. Instead of the plateau that he'd been wrestling with, every single fast found us at a new low, and over a period of a few months, he'd lost 60 pounds. Don't practice intermittent fasting. Practice fasting intermittently. If you're looking for health and fitness benefits from fasting, you need to be just as smart about your fasting practice as you are about your exercise practice. Remember, if you do something every single day, the body responds to it by adapting, and then doesn't adapt anymore. If that whole scheduling thing sounds really intense for you, maybe we should do a jumpstart together. You can find the link in the show notes below, and let me know in the consultation practice that you'd like to work a fast into our process. I'll help you schedule it intelligently and troubleshoot some of the issues that you struggle with there. That's definingdadbod.com/jumpstart, or the links in the show notes below. We got one more tip to go, and we'll wrap this show up as a great foundation to start a fasting conversation here. The last thing you need to know, number 5, about beginning a fasting practice is get some support. It's been my experience that if somebody hasn't gone without food for a long time, going without food can be a scary thing. Sure, Coach Alex told you you're not going to die because you could theoretically go without food for 30 whole days without dying, so it really shouldn't be that scary, right? Well, there's a lot more to it than that. Turns out we eat for a number of reasons that have nothing to do with staying alive. Sometimes we eat because it's mealtime. Sometimes we eat to regulate our emotions. Sometimes we eat as an excuse for a break from what it is we're up to right now. Sometimes we're bored. Sometimes we're making peace with our neighbor, or even more importantly, our wife. And sometimes we eat because a 3-year-old shoves a graham cracker down your throat and not chewing it will result in you throwing it up. There are many different reasons why we eat every day. And while fasting is a theoretically simple decision to make, gee, I'm not going to eat today. Let's see how that goes. It also shines a direct light on literally everything that your food impacts in a day. If you've never done it before, it can be very overwhelming, and things can become obstacles for you that you never imagined were driving forces in your food. These sorts of realizations and that sort of weight requires a powerful support system, preferably one that you're not brushing shoulders with while you're fasting. Remember, part of the winning mindset of the fast is to be yourself in such a way that nobody in your daily life notices that this is you without food. And in my practice, I've found that there are only 2 ways to accomplish being you without your food. 1, lots and lots and lots of practice and patience. 2, a partnership with somebody who's had lots and lots and lots of practice and patience. There really is no way around it. If you're not practiced in fasting, you need a powerful support system. Either a coach, a community of people who are fasting regularly, or a friend or mentor who's been there, done that, got that t-shirt, and can help you keep your head right and do what you say you're going to do. And I know this to be true because of the clients that I've worked with who've told me, Alex, I never would have got through that without you. So the number 5 thing you need to know about developing a fasting practice is get connected to a powerful support system that can help you work out the kinks and stay accountable to a positive and disciplined fasting practice. The last thing I'll say about fasting here, before we wrap things up, is a list of don'ts. Don't try to fast if you're still an adolescent, pregnant, breastfeeding, or undergoing current treatment for thyroid, kidney, liver, or heart disease. Each of these states are not amenable to fasting, and at the very least, should be done under the supervision of a licensed medical professional. You should also be very wary of incorporating a fasting practice if you have a past history of untreated disordered eating. Anorexia, bulimia, or orthorexia can all be indications that a fasting practice will own you rather than you owning your fasting practice. And my other don't for you is don't get discouraged. If you've tried fasting and it doesn't work well for you, maybe you just need a second opinion. Reach out to a practitioner you trust, and if you don't have one of those, I'd love to be a help to you. Shoot me a message at coachal@definingdadbod.com. So there you have it, an intro to fasting. I hope my story, the definition of fasting, and these 5 tips to help you get started give you a good foundation and springboard to incorporate a powerful fasting practice into your health and fitness journey. This has been Alex Van Houten with Defining Dad Bod. Until next time, guys, kick butt, take names.
Thank you for joining us for your 1% Better today. Don't forget to subscribe for the podcast. Leave us a raving review to tell others how Better Daily has helped you in your journey. If you want more Better Daily, download our app and join our Betterment family at betterdaily.live. Use code POD to get 25% off your subscription. That's POD, all caps, to save 25% on your subscription. We all have a cross to carry. It's lighter when we do it together. Go to betterdaily.live today.